Hi folks, today we're going to talk about one of the most enigmatic and misunderstood figures and time periods in ancient history, Akhenaten and his Atenism, here on Lessons from the Purple Chair. Hi folks, and welcome back to Lessons from the Purple Chair, one intellectual's musings from the comfort of a big purple wingback. Folks, I have degrees, as I said, in comparative religious studies, but I've also studied a lot of history, as well as anthropology and other topics. And history is also one of my favorite topics to research and study. And one thing with scholars is that we strive to find the most facts we can and only speculate, staying close to those facts. But in truth, in history, that speculation often runs to a lot of romanticism. We just can't seem to help ourselves. It's just, we're human. So a lot of times some of these stories we'll tell, or these speculations as to what happened, are really, I think sometimes subconsciously influenced by kind of a romantic ideal of it. And I can give a lot of examples of that. One of my favorites was when they found Otzi, the Iceman, back in the early 90s. I saw so many documentaries on Discovery Channel and History Channel and all the rest, as well as read so many articles about speculations as to why he was up on that mountain and why he froze to death. And, the one I heard the most was he may have been a shaman and that he was on kind of a vision quest and that he died out there in the snow in this vision quest. I heard it several times until they found a arrow in his back, a cut on his hand that went almost to the bone, and that he had blood of other people on his coat. So apparently this shaman had gotten one heck of a fight and give is almost as good as he got. So that vision quest wasn't talked about anymore. Another example, and this one goes with ancient Egypt and the romanticism surrounding Tutankhamun, and oh my, is there a lot. I could go over the whole curse thing, but I won't here. I'm actually going to make a Tutankhamun a separate video. But one of the things I hear most is speculation, once again, is how he died. And after they did the CT scans back in late, I think it was around 2010, they found that he had his kneecap knocked off on the bum side of his leg, and I started hearing, he may have fell off a chariot in war and broke his kneecap, and that's the reason it got infected and he died. Well, I'm kind of like Mr. Miyagi said to Daniel when he said that he fell off his bike. Very interesting you didn't hurt your hands. And Tutankhamun had no injuries to his hands whatsoever. And if you fall off of a chariot or fall off anything like that, first thing is to put your hands out or your elbows or something. But it's only he only had a busted kneecap. I mean, we can't know that he was on a chariot. In fact, considering some of his health issues, he probably had a hard time controlling a chariot. He could have just easily slipped and fell and hit his knee either on the floor tile or on a corner of a step and broke it off. And that seems far more, not as romantic, but far more likely. And you find these type of examples like this throughout history. Now, the study of history. Now, but one of the biggest that I've heard, and is so accepted, especially with the public, is about the pharaoh Akhenaten, one of the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, and his Aten religion, and the time period of his rule known as the Amarna period, after the the Wadi Amarna where he built his city. And what I hear is, oh, he was a he was it was like this age of Aquarius. He was a gentle pharaoh, rather than being shown fighting great battles or smiting his enemies like other pharaohs. He was shown in family moments. And rather than the great sacrifices, he's shown offering flowers to the gods. He's standing under his god with his wife and his children. He was a gentle pacifist family man. He was a monotheist, one of the first monotheists to believe in only one God. Yeah, he was a forerunner, like a prophet of like Moses, and may have influenced Moses and all of that. Well, I'm here to burst a lot of those bubbles, because pretty much all of that is crap. It is crap. Now, you got to understand something. I still see this a lot in documentaries, on some of the channels about Akhenaten. But you got to remember one thing about documentaries. And I love documentaries, and I think they're wonderful that they put those out. They're educating people, Even if they're a little off, at least they're getting the basics in there. And I think that's a wonderful thing. However, just like any other program, they're trying to get ratings. They're trying to get money, for sponsors. Ratings lead to sponsors lead to money. And that way, they're no different than any other type of entertainment. A good example of that is all the secrets of the whatever. My favorite is Secrets of the Pyramids. I hate to be the one to burst the bubble here, but we know a lot about the pyramids. There are still some questions we have on the pyramids, but they mostly surround what kind of ramp do they use, because we know the name of the architect of the Great Pyramid. We found the bodies of the people that built the pyramid. So we know how, even the mathematics that they used to make the pyramid, to graft it, to get the mathematical figures, which is basically just 211. I'm going to go over that in another video. But yet, always they put on these secrets of the pyramids, mysteries of the pyramids. That's because the public doesn't know that, all of this research and all that we already do know about the pyramids. Because, once again, they're trying to get ratings. And, But today, on Akhenaten, I'm going to tell you basically how it really was, the real Akhenaten, and the real Atenism, and the real motives for it. And I can pretty much guarantee you haven't seen this in a documentary. And if you have, please let me know, because I'd like to watch it. It'd be nice to see somebody actually tell it the way it most likely was. Okay? Now, first, let me talk about my qualifications to talk on this subject, which is something a person should always question on anything you're watching on the internet. So, anybody can get up and say anything they want on the internet, on YouTube or whatever, but, how qualified, what kind of training do they have? Do they have any actual certification to be talking about this subject? And therefore, I'll tell you mine. Now, it's true that I'm a professor of comparative religious studies. However, in my education, my college education, I had nearly as much Egyptology training as I have in comparative religious studies, especially in my undergrad, because at one time I was actually double majoring in comparative religious studies and Egyptology. And it was a little bit of a toss-up as to which way it would go, because I'd had almost an equal fascination and obsession with ancient Egypt as a kid as I did with comparative religious studies. Comparative religious studies definitely dominated, but Egypt was the second runner-up. And because I was going to one of the best schools for Egyptology in the world, University of Pennsylvania, I just couldn't pass it up. I mean, it was really lured in. So I did double major in my undergrad. However, when I got into the master's program, I decided to go with my greatest passion, and that'd be comparative religious studies, because actually to further pursue become a true Egyptologist in the PhD program takes a long time and a lot of money, and doctors train about as much, medical doctors, and I have a lot of respect for that. But I'm like, that's a lot of training, and I was more passionate about religious studies. However, in my undergrad, I took all the classes with some of the best Egyptologists in the world. I took Middle Egyptian to learn how to read hieroglyphs and the ancient Egyptian dead language as best we know it. So yes, I'm quite qualified to speak on this subject. Now, now let's get started on Akhenaten. Now, Akhenaten, of course, who was originally known as Amenhotep IV, was the son of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, and his rather glamorous and very intelligent and influential mother, Queen T. Then this was in the 18th dynasty, the first dynasty of the New Kingdom, and he ruled sometime around about 1350 in that area, 1550 BCE. But to understand his great religious revolution that he attempted, first you have to understand a little bit about the Egyptian politics as well as religion, and the two are completely linked. We often try to compare present, or we reflect our own, inject our own religious ideals and mentalities on ancient religion, and that doesn't work. It's a whole different ballgame. And in ancient Egypt, religion and politics were one. This was a theocratic system by which the pharaoh was seen as the high priest, as well as a god king himself, a god himself, by which he was worshipped, and he was the one that communed with the other gods. That was his. In fact, his job was to keep the ma'at, which it means the balance or the order between the gods, the people, and the land, and that was his whole job. Beloved of Ma'at was one of the great titles of the pharaoh. And in the original, if you go back to the Old Kingdom, the time of the pyramids, at that time period, the cult of Ra, the sun god, was dominant. Egyptian religion went through a lot of, it went through a lot of evolutions. It lasted over 3,000 years. Went through a lot of evolutions. It had a lot of different cults and groups, and certain gods were more dominant in other regions. But in the area in and around where the pharaoh, Memphis and that area, the god Ra was the great god, and that was the god that was associated with the pharaohs. The pharaoh was the Sahra, the son of Ra, and he was a true god, worshipped as a god. He was a god king, which is one of the reasons of the symbolism of the Sphinx. The Sphinx is a great lion, which is one of the animals associated with Ra, along with a falcon, with the head of the king, showing that the king was not only a great protector, like a lion, of his pride, of his people, a great warrior and great defender of his people, but he also was like his head was on an animal of the god Ra, so he was a god king on earth, and the Sphinx was a great symbol of that. That's the reason they carved that giant Sphinx between the pyramids, where they laid these god kings to rest of the Old Kingdom. And their word was absolutely unquestionable. The pharaoh owned everything and everybody in Egypt. So, and that power was absolute. Now, by the time you got to the 18th dynasty in the New Kingdom, over 1,000 years later, it was 2,000 years later, even the king was still seen as a god king, the beloved of Ma'at, and the titles were still there. Sarah, the son of Ra. Mattering on the time of the period of Egypt, and Egypt lasted a long time. Like I said, that position sometimes is more. He was seen as a king, and somewhat divine. They kind of waffled on it, on how much divine he was. And by the New Kingdom, that position was a little bit even questioned, a little bit. Not really questioned. It just wasn't as strongly felt as before. He was, was it just lip service? And that's the question you got to ask. But what had happened was that by the time of Akhenaten and his father Amenhotep III, the cult of Ra was not as powerful as the cult of Amun. Amun had become the prominent god. It wasn't odd for certain gods to become the prominent god of the state religion. It had changed a few times. It had been Ra in the Old Kingdom. In the Middle Kingdom, or a good part of it, it was Montu, the god of war. And then toward the midst of the Middle Kingdom, Amun come into power. Now, Amun was one of the Ogiod gods of Thebes. Originally was a god of the air, and his name basically means the unknown. But once he got a pharaoh's patronage, it became the state religion, and Amun quickly became the great god, the king of the gods, the lord of the gods, all of this. Like I said, there's a lot of mythologies and a lot of cults and groups in Egypt, but Amun was the god of the state religion. And by the time of Amenhotep III and Amenhotep IV to become Akhenaten, the cult of Amun had become very, very powerful. In fact, it's said that they owned about 25% of the lands of Egypt, and a lot of times they held very high positions in the government, because once again, there is no separation of religion and state in a theocracy, which is what the Egyptian system was. In fact, how the taxes worked in Egypt gives you a good indication. Each god had a section of land, kind of like a state, or called a nome, or a region. And in that nome, there would be a temple to that god. And every day, every week, every month, and every year, there was a schedule of tribute to be brought to the god, offerings to be brought to God. Everything from gold to spices to cattle to grain, to livestock. All of this stuff was to be brought to the temple on a certain schedule. And as they say, what the god didn't eat or keep would be distributed out to the army, to the royalty, to the army, to the servants, to the bureaucracy. In other words, these offerings to the gods were actually the taxes of ancient Egypt. It was a temple system, and that's the way it worked. So that's how tied in that religion and politics were one in ancient Egypt. Now, one of the reasons that the cult of Amun had become very powerful and started to become a threat to the pharaoh's power itself, you have to go back to the beginning of the 18th dynasty. Now, at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, Egypt was just coming out of what's known as the second intermediary period, where the pharaonic power broke down. And Egypt had separated again. And in this case, what had happened is a group known as the Hyksos, which is a Greek word, Greek translation of an Egyptian word for basically the foreign people. This foreign group, most likely coming out of Canaan, had moved into Egypt due to a great long famine, likely the famine mentioned in the Bible. There is a stone record of this great famine that lasted several years. And Egypt is the breadbox of that part of the world, because it doesn't depend on the rains. It depends on the flooding of the rivers in Ethiopia, not in the Middle East. So, and it floods the rivers it floods the Nile and leaves that great rich topsoil. It brings down out of the mountains, and that's what causes Egypt to live. So during times of famine in the Middle East, the Egypt, which is in Africa, bordering with the Middle Eastern countries, became the breadbox. Everybody went where the food was. And it looks like these Hyksos didn't invade and take over. They just kind of filtered in. They just kind of started coming in and eventually took over. They took over they took over Lower Egypt, and Egypt was divided once again between Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. The traditional Egyptians in Upper Egypt in Thebes, and the Hyksos running their kingdom in Lower Egypt. And this is the first time that Egypt had been divided between Upper and Lower Egypt since Narmer, the founding pharaoh of the unification of Upper Egypt 5,000 years ago. So during the late 17th dynasty of the Theban original kings of pharaohs of Egypt, they fought against the Hyksos, particularly a pharaoh named Kamos, and he was actually killed in running them out of the country. And his brother Ahmose finished the job, kicked the Hyksos out, reunited Upper and Lower Egypt into one kingdom, once again unification, and he became the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, which is the start of why we call it the New Kingdom. And during this time, especially with Ahmose, he was a great patron of Amun, and the cult of Amun really did become even more prominent as the state religion. Now, when it became a threat, though, came with Ahmose's granddaughter, the famous Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh. What had happened is that she had been married to her brother Tutmosis the second. Her father, Tutmosis the first, had actually been married to Ahmose's daughter, and he had been a great pharaoh. So you had Ahmose, the great legendary founding pharaoh, and you had Tutmosis, the great warrior pharaoh, and she was Tutmosis the first daughter, and she married her brother Tutmosis the second. He didn't live very long, and when he died, he and Hatshepsut had not had a son. However, Tutmosis II had a son with one of his lesser wives, and his name was Tutmosis III, but he's only 5 years old. So women could not be pharaoh. In fact, there's no word for queen in ancient Egypt. Whenever we say Queen Nefertiti, Queen Nefertari, Queen T, that's our own translation of it, our own edition. It's actually most beloved wife or first wife of the pharaoh. So, in fact, the regalia, there is no word for queen. The regalia are all masculine. So, but a woman could be a regent, basically rule in the name of the true pharaoh if they were too young. And that's what Hatshepsut did. However, I guess she started figuring, hey, why should I, she got used to doing this for this 5-year-old pharaoh. And she's finally like, I'm the daughter of Tutmosis the first and granddaughter of Ahmose. Why shouldn't I just be pharaoh? So she had herself declared pharaoh, not only the daughter of Tutmosis the first, the granddaughter of Ahmose, but she was the son of Amun, the god Amun. And in fact, you can see from this stele, which actually is in the Penn Museum, it shows the Tutmosis III and his stepmother and aunt ruling together. Both their names and their cartouches on each side come together in an ankh, showing that they ruled together. Interestingly, if you notice if you can see it, Hatshepsut's name has been chiseled out at a later date because they were ashamed they had a female pharaoh. But now the thing is the titles. Egyptian titles had a formula, and one of the great formulas, always is Lord of Upper and Lower Egypt, Lord of the Two Lands, Son of Ra, beloved of Ma'at, because that is the pharaoh's job. Beloved of Ma'at is always there, and if you see here with Tutmosis III on his side of it, it says it's proper. It says beloved of Ma'at. However, if you go on the opposite side with Hatshepsut, it should say the same thing, but it doesn't. She broke the tradition and broke the ritual, and she gives the title beloved of Amun. It should be beloved of Ma'at. That's the proper formula. That's the job of the pharaoh, but she has it herself different as the beloved of Amun, because that is her propaganda showing that she was put on the throne by Amun himself. Now, it's very obvious from this that she had the backing of the cult of Amun, the high priest of Amun. And this set a dangerous precedent for the instatement of a pharaoh. Very similar to what happened with the Holy Roman Empire when the Pope crowned the emperor. Almost like he's allowing it. He is sanctifying this, making it prerequisite for the Holy Roman Emperor, to be crowned by the power of the religious authority of the Pope. Kind of, it doesn't look like this is quite happening here in Egypt with the cult of Amun, but it's getting very close. She's a pharaoh with the backing of Amun and the priesthood of Amun, and this made them even more powerful and a threat to the pharaonic power. As I said, it's said that they owned about 25% of the lands of Egypt, and during Akhenaten and Amenhotep's time, they held the highest of political positions, often even being the high priest of Amun, would often be the vizier, the second in command to the pharaoh. This was getting dangerous, and it was also kind of impeding on the pharaoh's divine position, the god-king position, because the cult of Amun if the cult of Amun dictated who was pharaoh, that made the god Amun and their priesthood greater than the pharaoh. So this is a power struggle. It's a little bit of a subtle one, but it is there. For instance, we start seeing a resistance from the pharaohs with the cult of Amun, going back to even Akhenaten's grandfather, Tutmosis the Fourth. Because these pharaohs wanted to get back to that the old kingdom cult of Ra, wherein the cult of Ra, the pharaoh was an absolute god, son of Ra, unquestionable, the reigning monarch, a god king on earth, and they wanted all that back. And Amun wasn't allowing that. And Tutmosis the Fourth put up an interesting stele between the paws of the Great Sphinx. It tells a story that he fell asleep, that the Sphinx at that point was buried up to the neck, up to the face. And he had a dream when he lay down to sleep there, it's between the paws. He had a dream that the Sphinx appeared to him as Ra-Hakati, Ra in the horizon, the great god Ra, who told him, if you all my limbs are weak from being under this sand, if you take the sand away from my limbs, you clear the sand off of me, I'll make you pharaoh. So in other words, Ra is making me pharaoh, not Amun. This is a religio-political move. This is a statement, and this is definitely a statement against Amun. Now, they still they are still very much playing to the state religion. You have plenty of reliefs and statues of them with the god Amun. That's part of the state religion, but they're trying to push away from it. Go back to Ra, the rather than Amun. And really, when the time you get to Akhenaten, Amenhotep the Fourth, his entire movement with the Aten is just one huge religio-political play on that motive to get the pharaohs, the pharaonic power, back to the cult of Ra instead of Amun. This was a clash between the cult of the pharaoh and the cult of Amun, and Akhenaten was determined to win this battle. His idea was just to completely override the cult of Amun with Aten. Now the thing is, the Aten is the sun disk. It is the face of the sun, and in the old now Ra was the god of the sun, and the Aten was seen as his physical manifestation, the actual disk of the sun. So really, this is a aspect of the cult of Ra, just in a more direct form with this god Aten. And to dispel one myth here is that this was a monotheistic religious movement that Akhenaten was starting. No, it's not actually monotheistic. Monotheism means that you believe in only one God and all other gods do not exist. There is only one God that exists, like we find in Islam, Judaism, Christianity. There is only one God, and all other gods do not exist. This is not what Aten was going for. And interesting, neither was the original God of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Hebrew Bible. It was the Atenism was actually a form of henotheism. Henotheism is not saying that other gods don't exist. It just that this one is greater than the rest. Ours is greater than the rest. My dad can beat up your dad. My dog can beat up your dog. It's that type of thing. This God is greater than than all the other gods, and that's really what the Atenism was about. And not only that, but even more specific is that only the pharaoh Akhenaten, which his name means the manifestation of the Aten, he of the body of the Aten. So he was the representative of the Aten on earth, and only he could pray to the Aten. Everybody else had to pray to him as pharaoh. Once again, establishing that old cult of Ra, old kingdom belief of the absolute God kingness of the pharaoh. That's what he was going for. So everybody else had to worship him, and he worshipped the Aten. And not only that, when we, people, then let's dispel something else. We see these reliefs on the walls of Akhenaten with his family, his daughters sitting on his laps, kissing his mouth, and they're playing around him and his wife, the Aten shining above them. And everybody's like, oh, what lovely family scenes, because, most of the pharaohs, they show themselves as making offerings to the gods of equal height, and they were smiting enemies with the great smiting pose, or they were riding chariots into battle. They were doing these macho, militant, kingly things. And here we have Akhenaten with, he's just worshiping the Aten above him with, it's offering him these hands, the rays coming down in hands, holding little ankhs, offering, which means life, offering life from their rays. Him worshiping with his wife Nefertiti, the beautiful Nefertiti, and whose name means she of the beautiful face, and his 6 daughters. And everybody's like, well, this shows that he was like a gentle family man and all this. No, all art in Egypt has a religious, magical, or political motive, and these Amarna period or art and these reliefs have the same type of motive. Basically, he was establishing the royal family as not only was he a god king, but his family represented the gods. The royal family, the pharaonic family, represented the gods, and these were, and in fact, one of the groups of the family of the gods was the 9 gods, the group of a family of 9 gods. They include Shu and Geb, and then Osiris, Isis, Set, Nephthys, these gods, this family of gods. Well, these family of 9 gods, known as the 9. Now, if you look at these depictions of Akhenaten and his family, there is the Aten, the god. There is the Akhenaten, his wife, and his 6 daughters. That's 9. So this is replacing the old 9 gods. The royal family are now the gods, and in fact, normally when you see the cartouche, and a cartouche always shows the name of the king, his birth name and his throne name. However, during the Aten period, the Amarna period, Akhenaten had the name of the god Aten put in a cartouche. You never see that. But that links it to a king. This is a king's standard, and he is the king. He is the pharaoh. So he is the living Aten. This is another link to the state and the cult and the religion. So this whole religion definitely had a great political motive, and he did automatically. He started to disband the the cult of Amun. He had Amun chiseled out of his father's name, Amenhotep, and Amun chiseled off the walls of a lot of temples and mortuary temples and monuments. However, it didn't work. The cult of Amun was just too powerful. In fact, excuse me, we have a lot of evidence that the cult of Amun, the cult of Aten never did completely take root. Akhenaten had built his own city called the Akhenaten, the place of the Aten, out in the desert, which belonged to no other nome. It was not a nome of any other god. He moved the capital from Thebes, which guess whose nome Thebes was? Amun. He moved the capital from Thebes, the nome of Amun, to a nome that he said was dedicated to no god, dedicated to the Aten. So once again, he's getting out of their power center and establishing a new power center for the Aten and a new political center. He built this quick-made city out there, but even in this new city of Aten, archaeologists have found little statues of Horus and Anubis and Osiris and Isis and Hathor, and Bes. So even his followers hadn't given up their old gods. They were still worshiping them along with the Aten. So it really didn't change very much. And with the death of Akhenaten, it quickly the cult of Amun quickly moved in. Now, before we go into that, another thing that's speculated is that there was a great coup against this heretical pharaoh, who preached this one god, and all these pagan religions. They were all pagan. All these pagan priests. They plotted against and they murdered Akhenaten. We have no evidence that Akhenaten was murdered whatsoever. He actually ruled for 17 years, that's a pretty long run, actually, or pretty little above average run for a pharaoh. Most pharaohs ruled for about 10 years. Life was a lot shorter back then. And there's no sign there was any type of coup against the pharaoh. In fact, the entire royal family, a couple of his daughters, as well as it looks like Nefertiti, around year 10 of his reign, died. His mother, Queen T, who lived there too, she died during this time period. And then finally, the pharaoh and maybe one of his sons from a lesser wife. They all seem like to have died pretty rapidly. And that was one of the things that was questions, but now it looks like there was a reason. An archaeologist, and their names, I swear I can never remember this lady's name, it's very long, but a team of archaeologists actually did some work in Akhenaten, and they found mass graves. And in these mass graves, it was apparent that something had happened. But none of these mass graves, these burial grounds, seem to show any signs of like a massacre. No injuries, no bone injuries, no signs of violence. So they studied some of the preserved beetles and insects that were in these graves, and they found one thing in them: bubonic plague. Yeah. And in fact, it kind of matches the records, because later on, some of the Hittites actually blamed, one of the reasons they went to war with the Egyptians during the time of Akhenaten, were taking lands from him, was because that they said that when the ambassadors from Hatti had come to Akhenaten, that they had give them a great disease, give them the great plague. So, and now we have evidence of that plague. It was bubonic plague, probably broke out among the workers, but it was spread, and that would answer why so much of the royal family died in kind of rapid succession over a couple of years. Probably took out Queen T, probably took out Nefertiti, and probably even took out the pharaoh himself. And also, that was a great piece of propaganda for the cult of Amun and everyone else that wasn't for Atenism, saying that, see, this great plague, this pestilence among them, it's a punishment of the gods for rejecting the gods. And they played that up. But either way, not long after Akhenaten died, there was a time period there of a few years where it looks like either his a man named Semenkari. We're not really sure if he was Akhenaten's younger brother from one of his father's a wife from one of his father's other concubines, or possibly even Akhenaten's older son. But he became pharaoh for a couple of years, but then he died, likely of the same thing. And it was after that we have the famous Akhenaten came to the throne at the age of 9. And there's been a lot of speculation as to who Tutankhamun's father was. It's pretty much been answered now from some finds from some of the Akhenaten tabulat stones, the building stones that have been looked at, and we have found record where it says Tutankhamun was the son of Akhenaten. And that makes sense, pretty much had to be. And we now know that Tutankhamun was likely a son, not with Nefertiti, but actually with one of Akhenaten's sisters. DNA showed that that Tutankhamun actually came from one of the sisters of Akhenaten. And I'll actually go over that. We found the sister's body, but we don't know which one of the daughters of pharaohs it is, which is very frustrating. This moment, we know it's one of the daughters of Amenhotep III, but we don't know which one. And she is definitely the mother of Tutankhamun, Akhenaten. But when Tutankhamun came to the throne, the officials, the cult of Amun, Akhenaten moved the capital back to Thebes, reinstated the god Amun as the great god of the state, and he changed his name from Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten, to Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun, and he moved the power base back to Thebes, and the cult of Amun was established. So ultimately, this great experiment of Akhenaten with the cult of the Aten, it didn't reestablish the pharaohs. It didn't take off, and it didn't reestablish the pharaohs as back to the true, complete god kings that they had been in the old kingdom. And in fact, it can even be argued that it weakened the reputation and that complete divinity of the pharaonic kings from then on. It left a stain. This pharaoh had been a heretic. He was pharaoh, crowned pharaoh, but he had become a heretic. His name wasn't even to be spoken. But this god king had actually turned against the gods. But yet he was a king. This seems to cause a certain level of disillusionment in ancient Egypt, that the pharaohs never completely shook, and ultimately, it was part of their downfall. Now, true, dear, in the 19th dynasty with the Ramesside pharaohs, Ramses the Great, Seti and Ramses the Great, the power of the pharaoh was really returned to a great golden age for a while, but the crack was still there, and that crack slowly spread out, and the kind of this disillusionment and the absolute power of the pharaoh started to spread slowly but surely. And in fact, this may answer why there may have been an insurrection against the pharaoh during the rule of Ramses the great pharaoh, Ramses II, which may have been the source of the Exodus. Remember, that is supposed to take place in this time period. So Akhenaten, the whole thing with Akhenaten may have weakened people's belief in the absolute divinity of the pharaoh, and seeing him more as just a king and not so much a god. And the cult of Amun continued to grow in power, and ultimately Akhenaten, in fear of the power of the cult of Aten, was correct, because within 300 years after the 21st dynasty, the power of the pharaoh had really begun to weaken, and the power of the cult, the high priest of Amun, started to rise to the point that the high priest held more equal to more authority than the pharaoh. And finally, with the death of Ramses the 11th, the high priest Herihor actually became pharaoh. The high priest became pharaoh, and several of the pharaohs of the 21st dynasty were high priests of Amun and pharaoh. So the cult of Amun finally won. And in fact, the cult of Amun continued on even into the Greco-Egyptian period, when the Greeks associated him with Zeus. Amun was Zeus, and you got Zeus Amun, or they instead of Amun or Amun, they called him Amun. So you had Zeus Amun, but this time the Amun was associated with the ram. So you started getting depictions of Zeus with these Zeus Amun with these ram horns, and in fact, when and the great temple was even built for was even built for Zeus Amun, which was visited by Alexander the Great. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persians, and then when the Persians had conquered Egypt, Alexander conquered the Persians. The Egyptians hated the Persians, loved Alexander, and when he came into Egypt, they pronounced him a god king pharaoh, and the son of Amun. The prophet of Amun, the prime priest of Amun, the oracle actually pronounced him to be the son of Amun. And in fact, in a lot of coins, Alexander the Great is shown with the horns of Amun. So, so Amun continued on. And interestingly enough, we still carry the name Amun. In Christianity, later on, Amun became a demon, of course, one of the lords of hell. But the ancient associates still come. There's a part of the hypothalamus in your brain, which comes down, and it's actually called the carnu ominous, or the horns of Amun. So we even have it in a medical term. So in the fight between the Aten and Amun definitely won. However, what can be said about Akhenaten, I don't want to completely knock him. He did try a great revolution. He did to make this great, brave power play to get the power back for the pharaoh, to try to overcome the rising power of the cult of the Amun. And his great hymn to the Aten, which is found in a lot of the tombs of for the followers of Aten of the time, is one of the most beautiful pieces of ancient religious literature and verse. And in fact, it looks like him even, it was used over and over again as like a template. They just changed the name of the god. It's such a pretty poem, pretty verse. They just changed the name of the god, and it was reused as a template for a lot of different pagan gods. And in fact, it looks like it was so popular that it even made it into the Bible. There's a big similarity between the verses of Psalm 104 and the hymn of the Aten. If you look at the two compared, it looks like there's definitely some influence there. That this rather popular pagan hymn to a god, was so popular that it was re-edited as a prayer to Yahweh, and made it into the Psalms in the Bible. So Akhenaten left a little bit of his legacy, and he still has to be admired for this great, not only religious attempt but political attempt to take back power for the pharaoh. Well, okay, folks, that's all I've got on Akhenaten. I hate if I've disillusioned some people out there, kind of burst some romantic bubbles about, an idealistic bubbles about Akhenaten, and his religious cult of the Aten. But in truth, this was much more of a political move than some sort of religious revelation. And I know that can be a little bit disillusioning, but I also find it fascinating and very much part of the human story. Political and religious strife, the two go hand in hand, and definitely worked in ancient Egypt. And that just shows once again that that it demystifies them and shows them that humans are humans, and there are patterns in history. And a religious and political strife is one of the oldest. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed this video. And hey, if if you have any comments or any thoughts or any questions about about Atenism or Akhenaten, please feel free to leave them below. And also, my channel is getting a little new, I realize. So please hit that little purple chair and and subscribe and give me a like. And like I said, I'd love to hear from you. But until I do, find yourself a good book, find yourself a comfy chair, and find your passion. Later.